welcome to the latest episode in Let's Talk Decarbonisation with me, Matthew Stadlen. Delighted to say that I'm joined today by Dr. Roger Barker. He's at the Institute of Directors. He's actually the Director of Policy and also Corporate Governance at the Institute of Directors. So he has substantial influence there. And what I want to focus on, obviously, is the extent to which businesses in the UK are moving towards the government's target of net zero in 2050. So a very warm welcome to you, Roger.
Hello, Matthew. Very good to be here.
Could we just start by explaining in 20 seconds or so what exactly it is that you do and what you're responsible for?
Yes, absolutely. Well, the IOD is a Royal Charter body which is set up really to support directors and make their voices heard. We train directors, we connect them through networking, and we try to influence government policy on their behalf to create an enterprise economy and also a responsible business system. And I'm responsible for that latter bit, the influence part of the IOD's activities, really working with government, stakeholders and policymakers to try and make a better business system possible.
As someone in charge of corporate governance for the Institute of Directors, hand on heart, how intertwined in 2022 is corporate governance with the net zero ambition?
It's very intertwined. And I think this is something that's happened during the last few years, this interlinkage of a number of topics which previously were considered somewhat separately, such as governance, such as environmental issues. They've come together in this new trend of ESG, and they're considered together now. And corporate governance is going to be essential to address climate change, and climate change has become an essential and key part of the boardroom process, the governance process as well. So they're very much now interlinked.
Just spell out for those who don't know what ESG is.
So the E is for environment, the S is for social or social impact, and the G is for governance, ESG.
I think earlier this month, because we're speaking towards the end of May 2022, the Institute of Directors brought out a policy paper, the Green Incentive, and this is about how to put net zero at the heart of business planning. A really important word in that is planning. Explain to us why it's so important.
Well, a big chunk of our members really want to have a positive environmental impact and they want to address climate change. But only about 25% of them have got a plan for their organisations to actually make that happen. And really, there are challenges in the way of them actually doing what they want to do. And one of them is that to make the necessary adjustments to their company, there are big upfront costs. They may not have the expertise. And there's a kind of a lack of an immediate business case for them, especially as they're going into these very tough economic conditions at the moment, the cost of living crisis and inflation and everything else that goes along with that. And what we really wanted the government to do was to do its bit through the taxation system to create a clear business incentive for businesses, particularly smaller businesses, to decarbonise their businesses and actually try to make a contribution towards achieving net zero. And that's what the paper is all about.
To what extent has the cost of living crisis, and I'm thinking particularly here the cost of energy, to what extent has that focused minds, sharpened minds on the need to move towards this decarbonisation?
It has focused minds, and our surveys suggest that about half of our members are directly now looking at how they can improve the energy efficiency and the kind of carbon efficiency of their businesses as a direct result of what's been happening to energy prices and in the energy market. So in effect, these high energy prices are like a form of carbon tax, sort of market created carbon tax, which is now being imposed on businesses. And that does provide them with an incentive to think about energy efficiency and other sources of energy. Of course, it's also quite painful for them as well. And really what we want to see is, I suppose, a more orderly transition to a low carbon future. That's got to be a key part of any policy agenda.
A key incentive at the heart of this policy paper of the Institute of Directors is a reduction in corporation tax for those businesses that reach net zero. So they would pay a lower corporation tax than those businesses that fail to do so. Do you think that really can work? Is it enough of an incentive?
It's part of the toolkit, I think. There are no quick fixes or panaceas in this area, but it really, I think, can create a real incentive for businesses to address this. The key thing is that there would be a wedge between the rate of corporation tax paid by net zero companies and those that are not yet net zero compliant. I mean, that doesn't necessarily have to be a higher or a lower tax rate, corporation tax rate, than we have currently. The key point is that there is a difference, a differential between the tax rate paid by those two types of companies. And we're not saying that that should be implemented immediately. Companies would be given a few years' notice so that they could plan in a way to take advantage of becoming a net zero company and having a lower tax rate. But it is one of the things we think, which is that provides this clear business case for companies, which at the moment is somewhat lacking.
You represent a wide range of British businesses, and I think the Institute of Directors goes beyond these shores as well, if I'm not wrong. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, you represent smaller businesses, very, very small business, startups, medium-sized businesses. You represent big businesses as well. Have you got a sense, Roger, of whether bigger businesses are finding it easier than smaller businesses to move towards net zero?
Yes, my sense is that a lot of the activity that's happened so far has centered on larger businesses. Larger businesses, of course, have got significant internal resources. They have the capital resources available to invest in new technologies. They're being put under pressure externally from institutional investors, ESG-oriented investors. So they are feeling very much the need to make changes. And we have, for example, a new framework of climate change reporting, which is coming in for large companies this year. Well, in fact, it came into force in April of this year. The TCFD framework is being applied to large companies. Smaller companies, however, really haven't been subject so far to the same pressures. And that really has to change, because ultimately most companies are small companies, and about 60% of us work for smaller companies rather than larger companies. So they're a key part of the solution towards achieving net zero. And I think that this next stage of the decarbonisation process really has to focus on SMEs now, rather than just large companies.
Business is kind of the heartbeat of society in some ways, and setting up a business, starting up a business is a brave and important thing to do. Running a business can be extremely challenging. You represent the interests of these businesses, and so a huge number of different issues will crop up, I'm sure, and come across your desk on a daily basis. When you meet with directors of businesses, how high up the agenda of what they are concerned about is the environment?
I would say from a longer term perspective, it is as high up there as it is for any other members of society. But there are very pressing immediate concerns that they're facing. And we've already discussed the kind of cost of energy crisis and the uncertainties about the current economic environment, which are very significant. And they are, I think, facing a real quandary in terms of how they make the necessary changes. They don't necessarily have the right skills, the right expertise in-house. There is anyway something of a war for talent, I think, going on at the moment in terms of people with climate change expertise. And they face a lot of practical problems. So, for example, if they're thinking about how they can make their premises more carbon efficient, how do they get out of the existing lease which they've signed, has another 3-4 years to run? How do they find the funds to invest in a new IT system, which is going to also take into account the carbon efficiency and carbon impact of anything that they're doing? Um, there are many, I think, practical problems which they face and which they feel they don't have the resources or the expertise really to address in the very short term. And so they're kind of kicking the can down the road somewhat.
So what more needs to change then to change that? We've talked about the role that government can play, in your view, with corporation tax reduction. What about other incentives, and what about day-to-day or week-to-week support coming from the state?
Well, I think that, of course, is needed. And there are a number of areas in which I think government-business partnership could be really useful. I mean, if we're going to encourage companies to move to net zero, we're going to need a new system of accounting and reporting in respect of carbon emissions, which relates not only to large companies like TCFD, but also relates to SMEs. And we're going to have to find easy ways that small companies can use to account for carbon in the same way that they're currently accounting for profit and loss. And we're going to need an accounting profession that can help them with this. And we maybe are going to need things like kite marks, maybe something that the government could support, which allows them to signal their progress in the journey towards net zero. So, providing that kind of basic infrastructure in terms of how a company operates and reports on its activities, I think that's got to become part of normal life for even the smaller companies going forward.
You clearly play an important central role in potentially changing or influencing government policy in this area. How effectively do you at the moment engage with the incumbent government?
Well, we have a lot of contact with the government. We're engaging with ministers and civil servants on a very regular basis on this issue and many others. And I think that, certainly the government has made major steps in terms of, for example, its 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. I think that has identified the areas that need to be addressed if the business system as a whole is going to make progress in this area. But of course, a lot of what the government has done so far, I think, relates to establishing the targets, establishing the areas of focus. We've now got to make this happen. We've got to provide practical tools and real incentives so that business actually move along the paths that government has identified. And that is where I think we are not yet there. I can't say at the moment that actually the UK business system is on track to meet the target of net zero by 2050 and the various intermediate steps. And so there is a fundamental transition in both government policy and business behaviour that I think still needs to happen.
And if businesses don't themselves meet the net zero target, can we as a society, as a country, reach the government's ambition of net zero by 2050? Is it a necessary plank in that or not?
It's an absolutely crucial plank in that. I mean, if you consider the various aspects of society and the economy across which emissions are being generated to differing extents and in different ways, well, business is involved in all of them. And so unless business transforms itself, then we're not going to get there. But on the other hand, I don't think we can't underestimate the historical magnitude of what is required here, because we're actually demanding and looking for a complete transformation in the way business is done. And perhaps there aren't many historical precedents for that. And we've got to do that in quite a short period of time. And, it's going to be immensely complex and difficult to ensure that that occurs in an orderly way, in a way which doesn't cause social and economic problems. And that's really the challenge which faces us.
Looking at your green incentive policy paper, my sense was that there's perhaps not enough urgency at grassroots British business level for what is required. What can you do, if I'm right about that? What can you do to change that, to influence it for the better?
What I would say about that is that that lack of urgency is not caused by a lack of commitment amongst our members. As I said, about 80% of our members are extremely committed to having a positive impact on climate change and on the environment. So I don't think it's a lack of motivation. It's not, they don't need to be persuaded somehow that this is what they need to do. But I think what we have to do is face up to the obstacles, the practical challenges which they face. That is what is holding them back at the current time, as we've discussed. And until we look for ways, as government and business working in partnership, look for ways to remove those obstacles, then that lack of urgency and action is going to be an issue.
How do you feel British business is faring compared to other countries? You must have contact with those in similar positions overseas. What's your impression of where we stand, relatively speaking?
My feeling is that relative to many countries, British business is really motivated and enthused to really move forward in terms of achieving net zero. Of course, each country is in a different situation in this puzzle, so to speak, and the challenges facing them are different. Some countries have perhaps more manufacturing industry than we do, or more dependency on fossil fuels as part of their economy. But certainly, I think that if you speak to people in the British business community, there is, on the whole, a recognition that this is something that needs to be addressed. Many see opportunities in the transition, the new areas of business activity opening up. And they're also aware of the risks of ultimately not making adjustments, not only in terms of just the acceleration of climate change, but also the obsolescence of their old business models, the continuing high cost of fossil fuels, and assets and businesses being stranded in the past. So I would say that, relative to many countries, even within Europe, we are doing pretty good, I would say, in terms of our attitude and some of our actions.
Do you personally feel the hand of history on your shoulders?
Personally, I don't, but I certainly believe that we all have our part to play in this. Certainly there are some policymakers that are going to go in some countries who are going to make some absolutely crucial decisions about whether or not we get to net zero. But even those of us working from less august perches can play their role and make their contribution. We all can make our contribution.
Final question: what would you say to British government now? Your one central message to ensure that British business is in the best position to help this country reach the 2050 target of being net zero.
Work with us to remove the practical obstacles to business from taking action on climate change. We can do this, but we've got to do it together. Neither of us can do it alone.
Dr. Roger Barker, thank you so much for joining us on Let's Talk Decarbonisation.
Thank you.